Thank you, Karen. Yes, be afraid, be very afraid. That was a gift some years ago from a certain well-known tabloid newspaper, and as far as I'm concerned, it's the gift that keeps on giving. It is my privilege to be here with you in Leicester today and to be addressing the topic that Karen gave me, which is a rightful city. What would a city founded on principles of fundamental rights and freedoms look like and feel like? What kind of example could a city like that give to other places in this kingdom, however united or not, and indeed to other cities all over this increasingly shrinking and interconnected world? Well, of course, it's important when looking to the present and especially the future to remember the past. And goodness me, aren't we hearing a lot about Magna Carta at the moment? 800 years ago, that's 1215 AD, not 1215 in the afternoon. We know about the restless barons, and we know that this city has the accolade of having been represented. One of the 20 restless barons that extracted Magna Carta from King John came from this city, and that is a matter of great pedigree, no doubt. But let's also remember that just as Chaucer is not the end of the development of the English language, Magna Carta is an early beginning and nowhere near the end of freedom struggles for rights and freedoms, not just in this country, but all over the world. Magna Carta is fine as an inspirational document, and it is fine in providing the beginnings of your rights to physical liberty, not to be locked up without trial, and your right to a fair trial. But goodness me, there's a lot that is not in Magna Carta. There's nothing to protect you from torture or degrading treatment in Magna Carta. There is nothing to protect you from slavery. There is nothing to protect your personal privacy or indeed your right to respect for your family life, your freedom of association, your freedom of speech. And crucially, I would say, most importantly of all, your right to equal treatment under the law, your right not to be discriminated against. Why do I say that that is the most important human right of all? How can I say that when I've already spoken about torture and about suppression of liberty and free speech and so on? I tell you why. Because in my experience, everybody loves human rights, their own. It's other people's that are a little trickier to cope with. And if we really believed in the principle of non-discrimination, of equal treatment, of people rubbing along together, there would be no torture and degradation and slavery and so on. And that, I think, is the key to the human rights kingdom, the belief in non-discrimination and equal treatment. And of course, I'm guessing that you're in the dark, but I'm guessing that at least half of the people in this room are women. We have a big general election coming in just over a week. And for some people, the menu on offer isn't the most appetizing or delicious, but, that sometimes happens. Go and choose 2 starters, you still have to eat. And if you're a woman, remember in particular that we didn't even have the vote in this country until 1918. It's not yet been 100 years since the Representation of the People's Act, and I personally believe that it's a huge personal and ethical imperative to vote in elections. But my human rights story is not over yet, because we didn't get protections against slavery and discrimination and for our free speech and personal privacy until after World War II. After freedom-loving people around the world, some slightly to the right of politics and some slightly to the left, representatives of all the great world religions, who of course are all represented in this great diverse city, got together in a unique, yet to be repeated moment in human history and decided to set out in the Universal Declaration the non-negotiables for civilization anywhere. That's what Eleanor Roosevelt called a Magna Carta for all humanity. And that in turn is reflected in regional documents around the world, our own European Convention on Human Rights, brought home and made enforceable in UK law by the Human Rights Act of 1998. And that is now at stake. That is now under threat. There are people, very important people, very powerful interests in our country who want Britain to pull out of the Convention on Human Rights, who want to scrap our Human Rights Act that makes all of those rights and freedoms that I described real and enforceable in this country. I say real and enforceable, very difficult to enforce, of course, without access to advice and representation. And I would say when planning the future of your city, remember the importance of vital public services involving legal aid. We all rightly fight to protect schools and hospitals and public housing and so on. But don't forget that other vital pillar of the post-war settlement, legal aid, so that people can truly be equal in the eyes of the law, without which human rights will always remain a dead letter in a sealed book if people don't actually have the ability to translate those rights into practice. The court door will remain locked, and the powerful will be able to abuse the vulnerable at leisure. So this summer, some of the most powerful people and interests in this country will go to Runnymede and no doubt drink a glass or two of champagne and wrap themselves in Magna Carta, whilst at the same time suggesting that Britain should repudiate the European Convention on Human Rights and scrap the Human Rights Act. How does that work? Well, in the words of the great legal philosopher Tony Hancock, remember Magna Carta? Did she die in vain? There is a hypocrisy at the heart of that message, and it's one that I ask you to be aware of and to consider when considering the future of your great diverse city. And I do believe it to be a great model in this country and a model to the wider world. Your 70 languages, your people from all over the world, your diverse communities who come here and, broadly speaking, seem to rub along together in greater harmony and happiness than in all sorts of other places on earth. When planning the future, I ask you to consider the importance of a city where no one is subject to degradation, either in the home or in care homes or in hospitals or anywhere else, the hands of each other or the hands of the state. I ask you to consider the importance of continuing to fight against the exploitation of vulnerable people and modern slavery. I ask you to remember the importance of private and family life. What it might feel like to be a young man in particular from certain communities subject to stop and search within an inch of his life, and what that will do to his youthful ideas about the state and whether he has a stake in it or whether he feels excluded. I ask you to consider the importance of a city where people feel able, comfortable and confident about peaceful dissent. Dissent is not disloyalty. Democracy is not just about putting a cross on a ballot paper once every 5 years. It's also about what happens in between those elections. It's also about the right to associate and demonstrate and to speak. And working towards a city where everyone has that confidence. It's so important. And indeed, it goes to the heart of human rights itself. There are senior politicians in this country who think that the rule of law and independent judges and access to court and legal aid and all of those things that I passionately believe in, that those things are somehow anti-democratic. They think that the only legitimate power in a democracy comes from the ballot box, and those who win an election or cobble together a coalition after an election should then have absolute power until the next time there is a vote. That is not my idea of democracy or of a rightful city or of a rightful and united kingdom. Without free speech and fair trials, and a little bit of respect for personal privacy, and freedom of thought, conscience and religion, by the way, the right to the faith of your choice, the right to no faith at all, perhaps most importantly of all, the right to be a heretic in any particular faith community. Without all of these precious rights and freedoms, what is to stop today's democratically elected leader from deciding that all of these freedoms are too expensive, that criticism is treason, that fair trials are too expensive, that privacy must be completely abandoned in the face of other legitimate interests like fighting crime and terrorism? What would that feel like? What would it feel like to live in a city or a world with no privacy at all? I say it would feel like a life with no intimacy or dignity or respect between people. Not the kind of future that I think you want, or the future that you want for your children and grandchildren, and so on. So in looking forward to the future, we remember that human rights are always hard won. And in this city and elsewhere, they have been paid for, time and again, paid for in courage and in blood. Whether via the restless barons, or by the victims of the Holocaust and the Blitz, or by the suffragists taken to prison and force-fed, and we don't like to talk about that part of the struggle, but it really happened. Our rights and freedoms, whether to vote or these other vital democratic freedoms, were paid for in courage and blood and hard won. And a rightful city would protect them for future generations. A lot of nonsense is spoken about rights and freedoms in this country by powerful interests who want to abandon them. But the Human Rights Act doesn't belong to politicians, and it doesn't belong to the media. It belongs to each and every human being, every newly arrived asylum seeker. And look at how we're treating asylum seekers in this continent at the moment. It belongs to every newly arrived asylum seeker and every newborn baby. Every single person is entitled to their human rights just because they're alive. Not because they're a good person or a bad person or a taxpayer or someone who's made their contribution as yet, just a human being because they're alive. I can sum up everything I think about human rights with 3 words. Dignity. The idea that every single human life is precious. Equality, as in equal treatment or non-discrimination between people for the reasons that I gave, and fairness. Those 3 words, but the greatest of these is equality. Or non-hypocrisy, or non-discrimination, or empathy. Empathy. Because as I say, if we have empathy and we treat others as we'd like to be treated ourselves, the other gross violations of fundamental rights and freedoms are less likely to happen. Another way of putting it is that human rights are about caring for other people's children. Caring for other people's children in a way that we so readily and naturally care for our own. And that is really, I suppose, what's at stake in this current existential argument about whether we should have human rights at all, whether we should abandon that post-war settlement, the Universal Declaration, the Convention on Human Rights, the Refugee Convention, whether these documents are just too old-fashioned or expensive now. Some say we don't need them. We will have nationalism instead. We will replace human rights with citizens' privileges. Citizens' privileges. The problem with those, in my view, is that they can be given and they can be taken away. Why should internationalism and globalization just be for corporations and terrorists and organized crime and even governments working in cooperation together? Why shouldn't internationalism also be for ordinary people and their values and protections? So there's the choice. Do you want to be protected as a human being anywhere on earth and work towards that goal? Or are you happy to be treated as a foreigner almost everywhere on earth, with the lack of protection and the constant uncertainty that that brings? I know which I choose. But that is essentially the existential choice that this and future generations face on this shrinking, interconnected planet of ours, where every city, particularly a great and diverse city like Leicester, is a microcosm of the planet. To choose citizens' privileges is to choose the road to Guantanamo Bay, where it was acceptable, and it seems remains acceptable, to lock up other people's children and other people's nationalities. That's no protection at all. Equality, dignity, and fairness. And the greatest of these is empathy. Thank you for listening.